Okay, terrestrial ecology notes. This is video 2. It's going to be slides 20, 21, I think, through about 43. So let me skip ahead to where we left off at the end of video 1. Okay, so we should have covered biomass the last one. So now we're into decomposition. Okay, so decomposition, exactly what it sounds like. You guys all know what it is. We did the food webs earlier this week. As plant and animal matter dies, it's going to break down and return back to the soil. It happens a lot faster where it's warm and humid instead of, cold and dry, because that's where the bacteria likes to grow, and it's bacteria that's doing this. So you have, people get a little bit confused, but you have a detritivore, which eats dead stuff. So they do not work on decomposition. So that's not working on decomposition. And then you have a decomposer, and that is what actually breaks down the dead stuff. So this is like bacteria and fungi mostly. Okay. Photosynthesis is where the producers, where they start. So again, basic source of all food. This is up until the 70s, we thought that photosynthesis was the only option to produce energy, basis of all life on Earth. If we didn't have sunlight, we didn't have plants, there would not be any life on Earth. And that actually changed a little bit in the 70s and again in the 90s, when hydrothermal vents and deep cold seeps were discovered. And for sure rewrote the science textbooks. But this is still the vast majority of the Earth, the process that makes energy for 99% of life on Earth. There's just a few places in the middle of the ocean floor, miles down in the dark, that there's something else going on. But most of the time, this is it. So the basic process, and what I expect you guys to know: carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, and energy are turned into glucose and oxygen. Glucose is sugar, so just energy, more energy, and oxygen. So the plants are essentially making their food. They're taking carbon dioxide and water, and they're turning it into food and oxygen. Oxygen is a byproduct. The nice thing is, works out really conveniently, is that oxygen is what's needed by animals. So our need is the plant's byproduct. Our byproduct is the plant's need. So that circles animals and plants around really, really well. Productivity is the amount of increase in organic matter per unit of time. So you can see some areas on the Earth are really, really productive, some are not at all. And it kind of depends on where you are, but it's what you would expect. The high productivity are centered around the rainforests, whether they are tropical rainforests or temperate rainforests, whether they are, whatever continent they're on. But you see a lot of these pockets of productivity. Less than you would think when you really think about it. And then you see just the absolute desert, no productivity, there's no plant life, nothing going on. And notice this diagram does not show productivity in the oceans, which would be a whole other ballgame. This is strictly productivity on land. Okay, so the range that every animal will adapt to, every plant even, every living thing has a range. And it doesn't just have to be temperature. We can talk about the range of temperature, we can talk about the range of pH, of oxygen, of carbon dioxide, of nutrients, nitrates and phosphates, whatever chemical factor you'd like to talk about, look at. You could talk about salinity in the ocean. Every factor, every animal has a range for each of these factors that they will tolerate, including us. We have a temperature range. We have managed through technology improvements, quality of life improvements, to increase the range for a lot of these factors for us. We can tolerate a whole lot more. If you think about like temperature, we can turn the heat on in the house. We can bundle up in clothes. We can turn the air conditioning on, and therefore tolerate a much wider range than we used to be able to tolerate. But the point is that every species has a range that they will tolerate for every single chemical factor. And there's an optimum range where we like to be the best. There's a range where we're alive, but we're not really happy. Too hot, too cold. And then there's a range where we will not be able to live. Okay, so a lower limit of tolerance is where we're absolutely cut off. Upper limit of tolerance where we're absolutely cut off. And in there, in that whole zone, is the range that we can use to live. Carrying capacity is the maximum population of a particular species. We've done that already. Okay, so we've looking. I'll spit it out in a minute. Looking at carrying capacity over time, number of individuals in a population. You have different types of population growth. So you have biotic potential. This is all review. We've used all this stuff in human populations. Biotic potential of the species. Potentially you can keep going with unlimited resources. Keep going forever and ever. B is your overshoot. You're doing great, and then all of a sudden you're running out of resources, and now we have to go back down. C represents a logistic growth. This is assuming the limited resources. A linear growth if it's a slower population, and then E is your carrying capacity. Okay, so moving on to consumers. Consumers have to eat food from somewhere else. So if you go back to the producers, they make their own food. They're autotrophic. Consumers are heterotrophic. They have to get their food from somewhere else, which essentially is recycling. They're taking the energy made by the producers and recycling it, reusing it for their own energy. So herbivores are the primary consumers. They're the ones that eat plants. Carnivores are the secondary and tertiary consumers, and they are ones that eat. They are ones that either eat the primary consumers or ones that eat the secondary and tertiary. So you keep kind of going. This is where it kind of gets into a whole snarl, not really a nice, neat, straight line. Omnivores are both plant and animals, so they can be anywhere in this food chain. Remember when we were doing the food web, you can put an animal as a secondary, as a tertiary, as a primary. It depends on what they're eating. And in one food web, they may even count as all three. A bear may eat a salmon and a berry and a plant and count for almost all three. It may also be a detritivore, breaking down, coming across. Bears will eat carrion, will eat dead stuff, so they'll come across and eat dead stuff as well. So you can really put them wherever you want. There are some animals that are very flexible. So, producers, again, uses solar energy to make its own food. Photosynthesis, right here. Make sure you connect producer with photosynthesis. They are always plants. Okay? And then primary consumer is an herbivore, has to eat plants. Only eats plants. So this is the deer and the cattle and the antelope and the whatever else that eats plants. Secondary consumer is a carnivore. It eats mostly primary consumers. Most of them are animals. You've got a couple exceptions. There's always the exception that proves the rule. The Venus flytrap, stuff like that. Most of them are animals. Tertiary consumer, animals that are feeding on other animals that are eating animals. So you're kind of at the third level here. Hawks, lions, bass, sharks. So what makes them a tertiary is that they're eating an animal that in turn has eaten an animal. So there's the third level that makes them that much more complicated. Quaternary consumer, keep going, feeds on tertiary consumers. We are one of the primary examples of that. There's a few others. This is where you're really looking at the top of the food chain for a ecosystem. You're looking at the sharks, the leopards, the big cats, the maybe wolves, maybe bears, depending on where you look at them, but for sure humans are up there. And then decomposer, scavengers or detritivores, kind of depends on where you are. It digests parts or all. The waste of organisms, bacteria and fungi. Again, you have that difference between a detritivore eating dead stuff and a scavenger hunting and eating, animal prey that is already dead. So, a decomposer, and I already talked about this, decomposers recycle nutrients. They break down at a chemical level. So the key here is the chemical level. And then the detritivores are the ones that feed on stuff. They're actually eating, so they're breaking it down, but they're not breaking it down at the chemical level until they start to digest the food. They're just eating prey and dead stuff. Okay, looking at a flow of energy. You're seeing energy coming in. The plants are making their own, so they're using the solar energy to make their own. You're going into the consumers, into the decomposers. This is your basic one. And then the decomposers are breaking it down and turning it back into the chemical, in the soil, in the air, in the water. And then that stuff, in turn, is used by the plants. I mean, that's why we fertilize our plants, to give them this stuff that they need, that helps them make more energy more efficiently. Notice that we're always losing energy at every step of the way. We're losing energy. Okay, so food webs and chains, the whole reason that we do a food web or a food chain is to look at energy movement. We want to know what's happening with the energy in that ecosystem and why. Where is it moving from what to what? What are the key players in this ecosystem? What are the primary source of food in the ecosystem? What are the top predators that are controlling this ecosystem? And we point always up. We point toward in the direction that the energy is going, toward the consumer. Same thing, different format. You can draw it a whole bunch of ways. You see the different trophic levels as they go up and up. Decomposers off to the side. A lot of different ways you can draw this. And yet another way you can draw this. A structure diagram shows a decrease in energy. So we're looking at a whole lot of energy for primary consumers. We're losing 90% of this, we drop to primary consumers. Losing 90%, drop to secondary, and drop to tertiary. Okay, so we're looking at the amount of energy in a food chain or a food web. So it's the second law of thermodynamics that controls this, or that explains this concept, decreasing the amount of energy available, because you're losing his heat, you're losing his poop, you're losing his waste. The animal didn't eat the entire other animal, it didn't process the entire other animal, whatever the case may be. Okay, energy flow in an ecosystem, you're losing energy, and it's called ecological efficiency. It's the percentage of usable energy that's transferred from one trophic level to another. So you have 10,000 units, kilocalories, 10,000 kilocalories in producers, and then you go to 1,000 kilocalories in consumers, 100 in secondary consumers, and then all the way up to 10 in us. And so you lose that much every single time. And again, you see that structure diagram where you're running out more and more and more. So biomass and energy, I'm talking a lot about energy. We're using biomass to evaluate the energy. So biomass is the dry weight. It represents this stored energy. So it gives us just an idea. It gives us a way to measure how much energy we have, because energy is not something that we can actually physically measure. So it's an indirect measurement of the energy. We have to measure the dry weight and not just the weight in general, because water doesn't count as energy. It doesn't have any nutritional value. So even though we need it, it doesn't impact the energy level. So we can't use it as part of the weight. That would throw off our data. And that is, we'll do one more. The 10% rule, again, I've talked about 90% of the energy is lost, so we're moving 10% up the pyramid every time you go. So it's really more efficient to eat a salad than to eat a steak, because you're getting more energy out of that, even though steaks taste so much better. But that's why there's relatively fewer predators, a whole lot more plants than there are jaguars. Okay. And energy flow. Again, we're going to go always in the flow of energy. We have to weigh the samples and then, we have to dry them and then weigh them. So we start with our grasshopper, dry it out, weigh it. We can do the same thing. We use scat samples. We don't only use the carcass of the animal, but we use scat samples, skeletal samples, stomach content samples, stuff like that. And that is where we stop for the day.